At about 7 a.m. on June 12, 1962, the guards working at the Alcatraz prison were making their rounds after sounding the wake-up bell, making sure that everybody was up and getting ready for a nice long day of prison stuff, when they noticed that a prisoner named Clarence Anglin was still in bed and not responding to the alarms or to all the noise in the prison. So they opened his cell door, approached his bed to wake him up, and when they shook him, his head rolled off the mattress and fell onto the floor. One of the prison guards then said, "Oh my God, you killed Clarence!"
You bastard!
But then they picked up his head and they realized that it was actually a dummy head made of paper mache and real human hair. It then dawned on them that if Clarence Anglin is not here in his cell, then where in the blue hell is he? Did he maybe just have a sleepover at a friend's cell? Or is there another, rarer form of spontaneous human combustion where people just burst into paper mache? Or did Clarence Anglin actually manage to escape this place? Well, the guards then quickly started to check the other cells, and while they found no sign of Clarence Anglin anywhere, they did find a second dummy head in Frank Morris's cell, and then finally, a third dummy head in Clarence's brother, John Anglin's cell. After looking around for a little while, the guards sat down and they did some maths.
You take your 33 and a third chance, minus my 25% chance, and you got an 8 and a third chance, and then add 66 and 2/3%. I got 141 and 2/3 chance.
And they realized that it was quite unlikely that a rare phenomenon that has never been observed before, people bursting into paper mache, would have happened to all three of these guys at the same time. They also thought it was pretty weird that they couldn't find them anywhere on the grounds of this inescapable super prison. Therefore, the only logical explanation left was that they drowned.
Hello, how are you? I am under the water. Please help me. Here too much raining.
Which, when you think about it, is quite boring when you compare it to spontaneous human transfiguration. That would have made a much better story in my opinion. But nonetheless, the enduring mystery of what happened to these three Alcatraz prisoners has never officially been solved. And people have been wondering for over 60 years now if the trio actually managed to escape Alcatraz and start new lives. Or did they drown in the waters on their way to the San Francisco shoreline? Or did they turn into paper mache?
As some ancient astronaut theorists believe.
Well, no, I'd bet both of my kidneys that they actually survived the escape, and I'd throw in my liver just because I'm so confident. So, in today's episode of MMA, Mystorian's mystery ass whipping, I'm gonna cover the Alcatraz escape and all of the reasons that these guys probably survived. But because I'm not completely full of shit, I'll also cover the reasons why they might have actually drowned. Even though most of them are not even worth mentioning, to be honest. But in the end, we'll have an actual score so that we can weigh the odds for and against each outcome. And then we can all move on with our lives. Alrighty! Let's get ready to solve it! I don't think I'm a fan of that. I don't know, I'll work on something for the next MMA showdown. Anyway, let's start off today's video with getting to know our so-called suicide squad. First up is Frank Lee Morris. His superpower is escaping prisons. Now, Frank was born in 1926 in Washington, D.C. to a woman named Clara, who placed him in an orphanage, where he spent most of his youth. When Frank was just 6 years old, he was already stealing money from his teacher's desks and stealing the shit out of other kids' lunchboxes. By his late teens, though, he would move out of the orphanage and move into prison, after he got arrested for drug possession and armed robbery. Now, Frank was eventually released from jail, but he must have really missed it, because he would soon move back into jail after another incident involving armed robbery and car theft. Now, as hard as it is to believe, this guy was actually very fucking clever, and reportedly ranked in the top 2% of the general population for intelligence, and had an IQ of 133. But instead of using his brain for something good, like becoming a doctor or some shit, he instead used it to escape from prisons. The first prison he managed to escape from was the Louisiana State Penitentiary with a fellow inmate named William Martin. After escaping, they then hitchhiked and were dropped off at an old oil refinery on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. Frank Morris and his new BFF then spent a few months together in New Orleans until they had the irresistible urge to commit another crime. This time they robbed the bank in the small town of Slidell, and then they headed north to Kansas City. About a year later, Frank Morris was recaptured while, you guessed it, committing another crime. This time, he was committing a burglary. The police then looked at Frank Morris's rap sheet and they noticed that his special power is escaping prisons. So they had the bright idea of sending this guy to the easiest prison to escape from. And they of course sent him to Alcatraz, where he arrived on January 18th, 1960 as inmate number AZ1441. Moving on now to the other Suicide Squad members with John and Clarence Anglin. Now John was born in 1930 and Clarence in 1931, and they were both born in Georgia to seasonal farm workers, who clearly didn't have much to do in the off-season because John and Clarence had 11 other siblings. Moses! I can't even imagine looking after 13 cats, let alone 13 children. But well done, Mr. and Mrs. Anglin. Well, sorta, because 3 of their kids would end up in prison. In the early 1940s, the Anglin family moved to Ruskin, Florida, which is about 20 miles or 32 kilometers south of Tampa. A city, by the way, I fucking loved back when I worked on cruise ships. I did a 6-month contract where Tampa was the home port and we docked there every Sunday. And I gotta say, Florida guests were some of my all-time favorite people. Anyway, I don't know what the point of that was. But the Anglins, they moved to Ruskin, Florida, where the truck farms and tomato fields provided a more reliable source of income for them. Now, tomato fields and shit is whatever, but here is where it gets interesting. Because each June, the Anglin family migrated north to Michigan to pick cherries. And John and Clarence were reportedly inseparable during this time. And would you fucking believe it? They became skilled swimmers during their time in Michigan. And their siblings would say that it was amazing that these 2 guys would swim in the freezing cold waters of Lake Michigan as ice still floated on the surface. And we think that these guys drowned in the short distance between Alcatraz and the San Francisco shoreline. So you know what happens, right? You know what happens to escaped convicts who were skilled swimmers and swam in freezing cold water as ice still floated on the surface, right? Do you know what happens?
You just made the list! Oh no!
1 point to Team Survivor. Now, John and Clarence may be on the list of Mystorian, but how did these 2 kids get on the police's list as well? Well, Clarence was first caught breaking into a service station when he was just 14 years old. I personally at 14 was playing PlayStation, probably Crash Bandicoot or some shit, but this guy is robbing service stations. The brothers then began robbing banks and other establishments as a team in the early 1950s, usually targeting businesses that were closed so no one would get hurt. It's kinda nice of them, I guess. It's also quite nice that they admitted that they only used a weapon once, and they used this weapon during a bank heist, and this weapon they claimed was a toy gun. How did they use the toy gun though? Did they shoot those like sticky sticks at someone's forehead, or did they beat the shit out of somebody with it? I don't know. Anyway, then on January 17th, 1958, John, Clarence, and their other brother Alfred robbed the Bank of Columbia in Alabama, and they managed to get away with what would be the equivalent of almost $25,000 in today's money. The FBI, though, caught them all pretty quickly, and all 3 of the brothers received 35-year-long prison sentences, which they would serve across multiple different prisons, like the Florida State Prison, the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, and then the Atlanta Penitentiary. Now, after multiple failed attempts to escape the Atlanta facility, they were then transferred to the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where Clarence somehow managed to pretend to be the warden and organized a shipment of bread to be picked up at the Leavenworth facility and then be moved to a prison farm camp. After that was arranged and the truck was on its way, Clarence would cut the top of a big bread box and then put John inside the box, covered him in bread, and then cut the bottom of another box out and then put that box on top of John. I don't know if that made sense, but basically this guy is inside 2 boxes and he's encased in bread. And the shit was looking good until one of the delivery guys picked up the box and he was like, "What? That is pretty fucking heavy for bread." And he opened the box and he found John Anglin. So that was a big fuck up. and conclusively proves that that kind of shit only works in Metal Gear Solid. However, after this escape attempt, the authorities decided that John and Clarence Anglin need to be moved to Alcatraz, a prison much easier to escape from. And maybe now they'll be able to do it. And so John Anglin arrived on the Rock on October 24th, 1960 as inmate AZ-1476, and Clarence would arrive on January 16th, 1961 as inmate AZ-1485. Now, there was one more member of the Suicide Squad that did not manage to escape that night, and his name was Alan Clayton West. Alan's superpowers was stealing cars and getting arrested. Now, this guy was born in 1929 in New York City and was mostly known for stealing cars. He was also known for getting arrested a total of 20 times in his lifetime. He must have been going for some kind of record or something. But after a failed escape attempt in a Florida prison in 1955, the authorities had enough of this guy stealing cars and said, just put this motherfucker in Alcatraz, because if he actually escapes from there, at least he'll drown, and then everybody's car will be safe. And so, Alan West became inmate AZ-1330. And that is our Suicide Squad. And now we can get back to the escape. Now, after the disappearance was noticed at 7 AM on June 12th, and all the cells were searched, prison guards would also discover evidence of tampering around the vent in Alan West's cell as well. And so, he was interrogated about this escape. And this fucking narc fully cooperated with the investigation. I guess it's a good thing. I don't know why I called him a narc. It's just my character now to be an asshole. Now, based on what investigators found and what Alan West told them, they were able to paint a pretty clear picture of what happened that night. And this is supposedly how these three guys escaped Alcatraz. On January 30th, 1960, Frank Morris was placed into cell number 138 on outside B block. This cell was right next door to Alan West's cell. Now, it's unclear if they knew each other from before, or if any of these guys knew each other from before, with the exception, of course, of the Anglin brothers. But it's not impossible that they did know each other, given the fact that they all served time in the same prisons at around the same times. So maybe they did know each other, maybe they didn't. However, soon after Frank Morris was placed into cell number 138, Alan West got involved with a thing where he helped cause a commotion that drew the guards' attention so another inmate could stab another one. The guards, though, they knew that Alan West did this intentionally, so he got big bananas for it, and then they moved him to isolation in the D block. And here he would stay for a long time. Now, the actual Alcatraz escape wouldn't happen until June 11th, 1962, 2.5 years after Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz. And it's believed that during this time, that Frank had a conversation with a fellow prisoner in the brush shop, in which this fellow prisoner told him that in 1957, a guy named Willard Winhoven, who was the inmate electrician at the time, had removed a fan motor from the ventilation shaft to the roof on the B block, and no replacement was made. Now, Winhoven didn't use this as an escape method, he actually just served his time and he was released in 1959, but supposedly this fellow prisoner in the brush shop then jokingly told Frank Morris, "Ask the bull for the key." I don't know what that means, and I don't know why it's a joke, because it's not funny, but I suppose it means ask the guard for the key or something. Anyway, it doesn't seem like he did ask the guard for the key. That would have been pretty fucking stupid, but what Frank Morris did do was wait until Alan West got out of isolation in early 1962, and he then ordered an accordion just like Alan West. Now, this accordion will be important in just a minute, and yes, Alan West did play the accordion, and yes, Alcatraz did allow their prisoners to have musical instruments. Why in the blue hell they allowed that is a complete mystery, because these instruments could be used as weapons or tools, which is exactly how these fucking guys escaped, but we'll get to all of that soon. Right, now after Frank orders the accordion, him and Alan West and the Anglin brothers start planning the escape. Again, it's not clear if these guys knew each other, but Frank Morris seemingly needed Alan West for something. Then, over the following 6 months, these four guys widened the ventilation ducts beneath their sinks in their cells using fucking discarded saw blades that they found on the prison grounds. You know, the more I tell you about this story, the more you're gonna understand why they shut Alcatraz down. This prison was a fucking disaster. Discarded saw blades just sitting on the prison grounds. Anyway, they widened the ventilation ducts beneath their sinks with discarded saw blades, metal spoons that they stole from the mess hall, and an electric drill that they improvised from the motor of a vacuum cleaner. Now you might be thinking, won't a fucking drill make a massive noise and attract the guards' attention? Yes, it probably would, but you see, Alcatraz had a music hour, so these prisoners could play their musical instruments. So these guys would work during Alcatraz music hour, so none of the guards would hear the drill. This is one of the things that Frank Morris's accordion was used for. I cannot imagine what kind of fresh hell Alcatraz would have sounded like during music hour, but I suppose Nickelback is a good point of reference.
Look at this graph.
Now you might be thinking, well, how did they hide this hole that they were digging underneath the sink? Surely at some point a guard would walk past the cell, look into the cell, and not that there is a lot of cell to look at, so it's not like something is hidden outside of his peripheral vision, and he would notice there's a big fucking hole underneath the sink. Well, you see, these guys would hide their work with painted cardboard. Where did they get that? From the workshops. Alcatraz basically gave these guys all the tools and things that they needed to escape. Anyway, after doing this repeatedly, they would eventually get the holes wide enough that they could pass through them, and that they could access the unguarded utility corridor behind their cell's tier, and they climbed up to the vacant top level of the cell block, where they set up a fucking workshop. Alcatraz, man. Now, one of the first things they got to work on up here in the workshop were those realistic looking dummy heads. These things were made from paper mache mixtures of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, toilet paper, and used hair that they got from the barbershop floor. They would then put these dummy heads on their bed when they wanted to go up to the workshop, and they would put towels and shit underneath their blankets to make it appear as if they were sleeping. And this obviously worked. Nobody noticed a thing. Now, over some time, they managed to get 50 raincoats. Some of them were stolen and some of them were donated. I don't know what that means, who donated these guys raincoats or why, but they got 50 raincoats, and they used them to make life jackets and a 6-foot by 14-foot rubber raft, the seams of which were stitched by hand and then sealed with liquid plastic that they stole from the prison shops. And again, what kind of prison is this that has shops in it? I've actually never been to prison, so I don't know if they do have shops or not. I'm just assuming that that's weird. Even if it's normal, it's still weird. Who the fuck in a prison has money to buy things at a shop? Or do they buy it with cigarettes or some shit? They then used the heat from the nearby steam pipes to make the raft airtight. And then they even made paddles from plywood and screws. At this point, I'm just surprised that they didn't make a full fucking Iron Man suit and just fly out of there. Because I mean, if Tony Stark was able to make that suit in a cave, just imagine what Frank Morris with his IQ of 133 could do in Alcatraz that were giving him everything he needed to escape. Fucking hell. Anyway, when they were finally ready to make their escape, they climbed into that ventilation shaft to the roof and they removed the rivets holding a large fan in place. So perhaps that story of Willard Winhoven removing a fan and not replacing it was bullshit, because it seems like these guys removed a fan. Then, on the night of June 11th, 1962, just after lights out at 9:30 p.m., the guys started their escape. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers set their dummy heads in place and left their cells for the last time. But Alan West found that the cement that he had used to reinforce the crumbling concrete around his vent had hardened, narrowing the opening and fixing the grill in place. Morris and the Anglins noticed this while in the service corridor, but they decided to leave this dumbass behind. So they climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof, and shortly afterwards, some guards would recall hearing a loud crash as the guys broke out of the shaft. But since nothing was heard after that, they didn't bother going to check what the noise was.
Did you hear a noise? Must have been the wind.
Now this is what investigators believe happened after that. Morris and the Anglin brothers got out to the roof, and then they slid 50 feet down a kitchen vent pipe. Then they scaled two 12-foot high barbed wire perimeter fences. Then at the northeast shoreline, there by the power plant, they inflated their makeshift raft with a concertina that they stole from another inmate and modified to serve as an air pump. Now they chose this area to inflate their raft because this was a blind spot in the prison's network of searchlights and gun towers. This fucking prison is pathetic. So they pumped their raft here, and now they're all set to go. And investigators estimate that at approximately 10 p.m., they launched the raft into the water and they made their escape from Alcatraz Island. By the time Alan West had managed to remove the grill and re-widen the hole, the others had left without him. He went up to the workshop and he found an unfinished pontoon, a plywood paddle, 3 life preservers, his own fake dummy head, and an extra raft which was partially finished and left behind for him. Alan then went up to the roof and he poked his head out the top of the shaft and scared some seagulls on the roof, probably shit himself as well, and after he took a look around, he realized that he was pretty fucked. So he climbed back down, returned to his cell, and just went to sleep. You know, I shouldn't say this, but he may as well have just tried, because there was more than enough proof to implicate Alan West as an accessory to the escape, and therefore he was once again placed in isolation. For some reason though, he felt the need to brag to the other inmates there in isolation of his involvement in this escape. The other inmates must have thought that he was so cool how he failed to escape and just went back to bed. Anyway, this guy was a huge asset to the investigators who were now looking for the 3 escapees, and Alan West had no problem telling them what they were planning on doing after they escaped the prison. Alan West told the officials that they had planned to make it to Angel Island and then cross the small strait over to Marin. In at least one account, he claimed that they had talked about stealing clothes and then stealing a car to drive straight to Mexico. However, as the official FBI report states, their raft was never found, and there were no reports of a car being stolen that night. Therefore, they drowned. And that pretty much covers the escape. These guys have never been seen or heard from since, so the FBI's they drowned theory kinda checks out. You know, it would fuck it up if they came back and said, "Hi, I'm here, I'm fine, I made it, I was living in Brazil." You know, then that's a problem. But since that's not happened, it's not clear what happened to these guys. Did they drown or did they survive? And now we get to the boxing match, the Mystorian's mystery ass whipping. Let's take a look at some facts and theories and then weigh the odds. Did these guys survive or did they drown? I think we can start off with the very short list of reason that the authorities thought they drowned.
The 3 men went out over the roof, climbed the walls, and got into the bay. These 3 and 2 others who escaped in 1937 are the 5 men who may have got away from Alcatraz. All got into the bay, but none has ever been traced beyond that point. They almost certainly drowned. Has anyone ever escaped from here?
Yes, we are short a few, but they're not bragging about it. In other words, assumedly all those that we are short drowned in the procedure. There is, to our knowledge, nobody walking the streets today bragging about having escaped from Alcatraz.
Why are you so sure of that?
Why am I so sure? You hear the wind, don't you? And you see the water. Do you think you could make it?
And that's it. They didn't think they could make it. Well, Alan West wasn't the only prisoner who was questioned after the escape. A guy named Bob Sharona claimed that he gave Clarence Anglin tide tables, which is like a schedule for the tides, which he found in a San Francisco Chronicle page that he'd stolen from a trash can. Now, I'm not sure why he would lie about that, but if it's true, that means that the escapees at least had some awareness of the tide conditions. Now, according to these tide conditions and the tide schedule, between 11 p.m. and midnight on the night of the escape, the water was recorded as relatively calm. And since we also know that the Anglin brothers at least were also good swimmers, this means that the 3 escapees could have even swam to shore quite easily. Now, if that's not enough to convince you, I suppose it's worth mentioning that Jordan Freer was able to complete this swim. I suppose it's also worth mentioning then that Jordan Freer was 9 years old when she did it, and she swam this 1.5 mile swim in 55 minutes for charity. So Jordan Freer, you get the Mystorian's official pap of approval. Skibbity pap. But Jordan's not the only person who's completed the swim, by the way. It's been estimated that over 50,000 other people have completed the swim as well. Now, I was going to be immature and award 50,000 points to Team Survivor, but since I am aware of the rest of this script, it appears that that actually won't be necessary, because this is already a very one-sided fight. So I'm just going to give it 1 point. But the reason that 50,000 people have completed the swim is because there is an annual swim challenge called the Alcatraz Swim Challenge. And since these events began in 1981, and across the several different versions of it, there have only been 3 deaths that occurred during the actual challenge. One was from cardiac arrest shortly after going into the water, and 2 more where the cause of death is unspecified or I just couldn't find the cause. And while that really sucks and I wish the number was 0, Basic Steiner Maths tells us that using this control group of 50,000 people, you have a 0.006% chance of dying. But I do want to point out that these are all good swimmers. So what about some punk-ass dickhead prisoner who was not training regularly? Well, there is a story of a prisoner named Aaron Burgett who escaped in 1958 and he drowned. Like dead drowned. And they know that because they actually found his remains. However, in December 1962, 6 months after the trio escaped, a prisoner named John Paul Scott managed to get out and swam 3.1 miles or 5 kilometers to Fort Point, which is here at the southern end of the Golden Gate Bridge. And he survived. He was actually found there by some teenagers suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion, probably because he was naked. And the bay is a lot colder in December than in June. And he also didn't have a fancy life raft made of 50 raincoats. Rookie mistake. But the point is, he was alive. And it proves that it is very possible and gives us a new total now of 4 deaths and a chance of dying of 0.008%. And according to Basic Steiner Maths again, that's just a little bit less than a 100% chance of dying, obviously.
Look at this math.
And when you really think about the Alcatraz escape mystery, or actually why it's a mystery in the first place, is because a 100% chance of death is the only acceptable odds that the authorities could have possibly gone with here. Can you imagine? You're sitting at home in 1962 watching your state-of-the-art TV with pictures of adorable critters all over it, and then all of a sudden, breaking news. Lock your doors, 3 jabronis just escaped from Alcatraz. When officials were asked how was it possible to escape this inescapable super prison that costs a fuck ton of tax dollars to run and operate, officials said, quote, "Well, it's actually super easy, it's barely an inconvenience." They could have technically just swam to shore, but these guys that escaped were actually smarter than that, and they made a life raft from 50 raincoats. When officials were asked, how did these fucking guys get 50 raincoats? Officials said, quote, "Hey, shut the fuck up." So yeah, it's understandable why the authorities had to say it's impossible to escape Alcatraz. They had to make sure that the money was coming in so that they could run and operate it, and they had to make sure that all the low-life, good-for-nothing pieces of trash locked up at Alcatraz and all the dickheads who would inevitably end up there believed that there was no hope of escaping. And if they did try to escape, they would drown. Otherwise, what the fuck is the point of a super expensive, maximum security prison surrounded by water? So, when I watch this clip again...
You hear the wind, don't you? And you see the water. Do you think you could make it?
Me? No, I would probably drown, to be honest. However, I am pretty sure that if I had the adrenaline of an escaped convict, a life raft made from 50 raincoats, and a couple of life vests, I would probably be okay. And that brings me on to the next point of contention. According to that official FBI report, their raft was never found. Now, while I understand that they had to say that this place was inescapable, I don't understand why they would fuck up their own chances of catching these guys by hiding information from the public. Because it is apparently not true that their life raft was never found. So it seems that the authorities buried some of this information. But according to the official story, almost immediately after the escape was noticed, multiple military and law enforcement agencies conducted extensive air, sea and land searches over the next 10 days. On June 14th, 2 days after the escape, a Coast Guard cutter picked up a paddle floating about 200 yards or 180 meters off the southern shore of Angel Island, which is exactly where Alan West said that they were planning on going. And on the same day, June 14th, and in the same general location, workers on another boat found a wallet wrapped in plastic that had names, addresses, and photos of the Anglin's friends and relatives. Then, on June 21st, about 9 days after the escape, one of their life jackets washed up on Cronkite Beach, nearly 3 miles outside the Golden Gate Bridge. The following day, a prison boat picked up another life jacket about 50 yards or 46 meters off Alcatraz Island, with this one's strings still knotted at the back. But nothing else was ever recovered from the water. Now that is quite important, this whole nothing else was ever recovered from the water thing. Because since the Golden Gate Bridge opened in 1937, it's been estimated that over 2,000 people have jumped from the bridge to end their lives. Out of these 2,000 people, 1,600 people's remains have washed back up on shore, which means that on average, 3 out of 4 bodies will wash back up on shore. So not only do you have a 0.008% chance of drowning by just swimming to shore, but you also have a 75% chance of washing back up on shore if you drown. And according to Scott Steiner,
You take your 33 and a third chance minus my 25% chance, and you got an 8 and a third chance, and then add 66 and 2/3%. I got 141 and 2/3 chance.
No, Scott, you're wrong. It actually brings the odds back down to 0.006%, which, to be clear, is very fucking low. For reference, your chances of dying in a car crash at any given time is 1%. So that puts into perspective just how low 0.006% is. It's basically negligible. Therefore, we should expect that at least 2 of these guys would have washed back up on shore if they did in fact drown. However, none of them washed back up on shore. And that pretty much says everything you need to know about the Alcatraz escape mystery. And I never want to do maths again.
Look at this math.
But since we're on the topic of things washing back up on shores, this claim that their raft was never found is, like I said, not actually true. Because a raft was in fact reported to have been discovered on Angel Island the day after the escape, with footprints leading away from it. In a teletype all points bulletin sent to the Marin County Sheriff's Office on the morning of June 12th to the local police officers, FBI agent Frank Price wrote, quote, "Raft believed used by the escapees located on Angel Island." Does it prove that the guys rowed the boat there? No. But it suggests that they actually found the raft that they claimed they never found. Furthermore, the claim that a car was not stolen was also not true, because the following day the FBI sent another all points bulletin that, quote, 3 men matching the escapees' description were reported to be in the Riverbank, California area, driving a blue 1955 Chevrolet that might be identical to the one stolen in the Marin County area. So there you go, straight from the horse's mouth. Now this 55 blue Chevrolet was in fact reported stolen in the Marin County area the same day these guys escaped Alcatraz. And this claim was also corroborated by both the Humboldt Times and the San Francisco Examiner. Furthermore, the following day, a driver in Stockton, California, 80 miles or 130 kilometers east of San Francisco, reported to California Highway Patrol that he was forced off the road by 3 men in a blue Chevrolet. Now the only question now is this all true? No idea. But if I had just escaped prison, I would make sure that I don't drive like a fucking idiot and attract attention. But you know, these guys weren't really afraid of prisons. It's almost fair to say that they loved prisons. So maybe if it was them driving that car, they didn't actually expect to get away with being out of this prison so long, so they just fucking did whatever. Either way, it fueled all sorts of conspiracy theories that the authorities may have covered up the Alcatraz escape, and other theories that supposed the raft found on Angel Island was actually just a fishing net, and that blue Chevrolet that was stolen may have been completely unconnected to this entire case. Yeah, fair enough, the car could have been unconnected, but it's strange to me that that report was suppressed anyway, and of course, it's pretty fucking hard to mistake a fishing net for a raft. But yeah, I suppose it could have been a mistake. Doesn't change the fact that the Anglin brothers at least were pretty good swimmers, and if the tides were relatively calm, which we know they were, they should have been able to just swim to shore. They didn't need a life raft. So at this point now, I am already 141 2/3% sure that these guys survived the escape. But there's a lot more that supports this as well. Like for example, do you remember the other Anglin brother, Alfred? That dickhead that robbed a bank with John and Clarence? Well, he wasn't sent to Alcatraz, he went somewhere else, and apparently he was a model inmate. But then something very weird happened on January 11th, 1964. Alfred attempted to escape the prison and somehow became entangled in a power line, and he was electrocuted. He died. The reason this was seen as very weird was because he was literally only days away from being eligible for parole. But where it gets really weird is that Alfred's cellmate would later claim that Alfred received a message from John and Clarence, his brothers, and he knew where they were hiding. This was also confirmed by his other brother Robert Anglin, who came to visit him just a few days before he died. Robert later claimed that Alfred hinted that he knew where the brothers were. And maybe he did know. Maybe John and Clarence only told people who were dirty, so to speak, where they were hiding out, so they had some sort of leverage on them, you know, like if you snitch on me, I'll snitch on you kind of thing. Because the Anglin's childhood friend, a guy named Fred Brizzy, also had a convincing claim. In 1992, Brizzy, who is, a convicted drug trafficker, approached the Anglin family, alleging that he was there to make good on a promise that he'd made to John and Clarence. His claim was that while smuggling drugs into Brazil in 1975, he'd spent time with both of the brothers there. To prove this, Brizzy gave the family a photograph that he claimed he'd taken of the brothers. This is the photograph he gave them. Now, while the US Marshal Service has formally stated that they do not believe the men in this photo are the escapees, despite their likeness to them, several forensic analysts have stated that they do think this photo shows John and Clarence. Interestingly, Brizzy also claimed that the way they escaped was a little different to what people think. He said that rather using the raft to just cross the bay by paddling, he said the guys paddled around the island to the boat dock, where they attached an electrical cord, which was actually reported missing from the dock the night of the escape, to the rudder of a prison ferry that departed the island shortly after midnight, and they were actually towed behind it to the mainland. That's pretty fucking smart, actually. Anyway, a guy named Art Roderick, a retired deputy US Marshal who had once headed this investigation and also interviewed Fred Brizzy for himself, and also later worked with the Anglin family, called Brizzy's photograph of the two men absolutely the best actionable lead we've had. But then he also said it could still be all a nice story, which isn't true. The photograph could just be a misdirection aimed at steering the investigation away from the Anglin's actual whereabouts. So this photo really is a double-edged sword in this case. But a guy named Michael Dyke said that Fred Brizzy was a drug smuggler and a con man, and naturally because of that he was suspicious of his story. Fair enough. But what does Fred Brizzy's widow think of this whole thing? Well, she said that she never heard him mention seeing the Anglin brothers in Rio, and that he was a con man who was prone to making up stories. You know, well, I guess when your wife says that about you, then it's probably true. Now, Michael Dyke took a closer look at this photograph, and he claimed that physical characteristics of the Anglin brothers do not match the men in this photo. For example, their heights and sizes and shit are all off. But he also did say that it's difficult making a definitive determination because of the quality of the photo and ruling it out as a valid lead. However, in January 2020, an Irish creative agency and AI specialists at Identity used facial recognition techniques to conclude that the men in this photograph were in fact John and Clarence Anglin. Boom, motherfucker. The thing is though, I have not, do not, and will not ever trust AI. AI is fucking stupid. Just look at Facebook. But anyway, what is the conclusion on this photograph? Is this them? Is this John and Clarence Anglin? Fuck knows. But one thing is for sure though. Brazil is known as a safe haven of sorts for people looking to hide away like this. And even though the FBI went to Brazil a few times, they just could not find the brothers anywhere. But then again, Brazil is pretty big. Alright, how are these scores looking at the moment? We got 18 points to Team Survive and 5 to Team Drowned. Damn, Team Drowned is getting beaten like a government mule out here.
Well, somebody stop the damn man!
Not yet, JR. We still got more. Lifelong brother Robert Anglin also claimed that the family often got mysterious phone calls where all that could be heard on the other end was heavy breathing. While I'm not gonna award a point for that, I will award a point for the fact that Robert just suddenly up and moved to Texas one day and on his deathbed claimed that he had been in contact with John and Clarence all the way up until 1987, and that he had even spent some time with them in person. Now to be fair, I'm not sure how legit this claim is, because I'm not sure if this means that the Anglin brothers were in Texas, or if Robert was traveling to Mexico or Brazil or wherever they were hiding out to meet them. So, we're just gonna have to take his word for it. Now another weird claim from the Anglin family comes from Mama Anglin, who said that she received Christmas cards each year following the escape. One card in particular that she got in 1962 said, quote, "To Mother, from John, Merry Christmas." It has been argued that this card could have been written prior to their escape, and it was just in the mail backlog or whatever the fuck. But as far as I'm aware, these postcards that they claim to have received have never been made public. So again, we're just going on the word of the family here. But apparently, the handwriting on these alleged postcards matches the Anglin brothers' handwriting. You know, if all of these things are true, like Robert being in contact with them, Mama Anglin getting these postcards, Fred Brizzy actually taking a photograph of John and Clarence, and all this proof is sitting somewhere, I don't understand why no one's coming out to be like, yeah, they escaped and they made it. Alcatraz is fucking closed, man. Who are you trying to scare from escaping from Alcatraz and swimming to freedom? The 50,000 people that have done it for fun? Dude, I don't think it's a big fucking deal. The FBI comes out and says, yeah, they escaped. We have evidence they escaped. So be on the lookout for these fucking people. They steal stuff. Yeah, I don't know. Well, Mama Anglin also got Christmas cards and Mother's Day flowers anonymously every year until her death in 1973, where two very tall, unusual looking women in heavy makeup that no one in the family knew attended her funeral. Interestingly, the same thing happened at Papa Anglin's funeral, when two bearded men that no one knew attended his funeral. Was it the Anglin brothers? Maybe. Maybe not. Well, how's the score looking? Moses, 23-5. This is really a one-sided fight so far. It's like Brock Lesnar versus a nerd like Adam Savage from Mythbusters. But if a nerd like Adam Savage can survive the Alcatraz escape, then I think it's safe to say that it is very possible for 3 hardened criminals to do it. And that's exactly what the Mythbusters did in 2003. Adam and Jamie constructed a raft with exactly the same materials and tools available to the prisoners, and they successfully made it to land. And they didn't drown. And then in 2014, a study of the ocean currents determined that if the prisoners left Alcatraz at about 11:30 p.m. on June 11th, they could have made it to Horseshoe Bay, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and that any debris would have floated in the direction of Angel Island, which is exactly where the paddle and their personal belongings were actually found. What a fucking coincidence. Now, if they left before or after 11:30 p.m. by just a couple of minutes, their chances of survival then would have been very slim. The tides and currents would have fucked them up properly. But since they had the tide schedules, this should have been easy mode for them, getting into the water at the correct time. Now, the last point that I'm going to make, it's weird, so I'm not going to give it a point, but in 2018, the FBI revealed that the San Francisco Police Department had received a letter in 2013. This letter was allegedly sent by John Anglin, and this letter read, quote, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely," end quote. Now, this letter goes on to say that Clarence and Frank had since passed away, and basically John is asking for medical assistance or some shit. Nothing ever came of this, obviously, otherwise we would know the answer to this mystery, but fingerprint, DNA, and handwriting analysis on this letter was all inconclusive. So, the score right now is 24-5, and since I'm starting to feel bad now for Team Drowned, who I'm imagining to look like Adam Savage for some reason, bleeding from the nose and the eyeball, let's give him some free shots in on Brock Lesnar to try to even the score out a bit. So let me throw out a few facts and theories here that I've heard people mention when trying to convince everyone else that the escapees actually drowned. Basically, the big one is that they had to leave at the exact right time, which would have been somewhere between 11 and midnight, otherwise the tides would have killed them. The thing is, the investigators believed that they left sometime around 10 p.m., which means the waters would have been pretty deadly at that time. Well, then they were really fucking stupid, which is hard to believe considering all the shit they did to actually break out of this prison. Now, I'll be fair in a water point, even though this point that they had to start paddling at the right time is irrelevant. Because their paddles and personal possessions like the family photos and notes with names and addresses and shit were found close to Angel Island, like the study of the ocean currents suggested they would be, meaning they almost certainly left at the right time. They also supposedly had a copy of the tide schedules. So then why the fuck would they leave an hour earlier when they could just break out later and escape when the water's calm? The next point they make is, why would they leave their precious personal things behind? You know, those photos and papers with names and addresses on them. Well, maybe they didn't know they lost them. Maybe they did know and they just thought, fuck it, it's not worth going back to the Rock over a family photo. I personally would have also left that shit behind. The next point is, and I think it's the only really good point against them not surviving actually, is why have they never resurfaced? These guys were career criminals. They loved prisons as much as a fat kid loves cake. Almost as much as Scott Steiner loves maths.
30%. I got 141 2/3 chance.
Almost as much as the Mystorian loves lifting catchphrases from the WWF, even though I haven't watched that shit in 20 years. The point is, there's no way that these three guys did nothing stupid for the rest of their lives and did not end up in prison again. And it's a good point. There is no real satisfactory rebuttal to it. But I will say that we need to consider the fact that we don't even know where they went. The only decent lead that seems to exist seems to suggest that they went to Brazil. And as far as I can tell, the Brazilian police tend to be about as useful as the South African police, which is to say, not useful at all. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that if they did actually hide out in Brazil, which again was like a safe haven for people like this, then they'd be fine, even if they did do stupid shit. The next point is that in order for people in general to disappear so completely like this, they would have to let go of every aspect of their former lives, so their family, their friends, their hobbies, all of that stuff must be completely abandoned. Otherwise, they'd be able to be traced down and recaptured. And this is just another nothing point, because if the Anglin family is to be believed, John and Clarence were allegedly and supposedly always sending postcards and flowers, and were even in communication with two of their brothers, Alfred and Robert. So clearly, they did not let go of their former lives. Even still, if that actually was them sending that shit, it doesn't even seem like they were doing it to be invited back home, because Mama Anglin actually said in a newspaper article that she hoped her sons were caught, and also said that at least 10 of her other children turned out good. So if the brothers were in contact with Robert may have mentioned this to them, and they just sent the postcards and flowers and whatever out of respect to their mother, even though she seemed to sort of disown them. But the thing is though, there are some obvious problems here. First being, how exactly was Robert meeting with his brothers? Does that mean that they were actually still in the US? If not, how did the brothers get to the funerals of their parents, assuming those weird people were them? Hypothetically, if they were hiding out in Brazil, the logistics of traveling to Florida to attend Mama Anglin's funeral, it's a bit of a challenge if you're a wanted fugitive, because you can't just drive from Brazil to Florida. But then on the other hand, if they were actually living in the US after the escape, then yeah, the question of how they never resurfaced is the biggest mystery of all, because they were career criminals. Now that's not to say that all of this is impossible. They could have traveled from Brazil to Florida somehow. When there's a will, there is a way. If they were still in America, it is possible that they did reform and they stopped committing crimes. A person can change and be better. It's not impossible that they just kept living in America and just stopped their shit. Yeah man, stranger things have happened. Anyway, there's a couple of reports that I've skipped where people claim that they had contact with John, Clarence and Frank in one way or another after their escape, but ultimately there is nothing conclusive to suggest that they survived or they drowned. However, based on the MMA score here, 24-12, and that was me being pretty generous as well, it's fair to say that they probably survived. There is so much shit in favor of them actually surviving that the real mystery should have been, where did the escapees actually go? But hey, that's just my 2 cents on the matter. What is yours? Do you think they made it? Or do you think they drowned? Or do you think that they burst into paper mache and that I am onto something with spontaneous human transfiguration? And now for a special message for our channel members. This Alcatraz video has a cryptic Easter egg in it that will reveal what the next video will be about. Now I am putting another custom emoji on the line for the first channel member who can tell me what the next video is going to be about. Here's an example of what a channel emoji will be like, so it'll be your critter's face cut out, and you can use that in the comment sections in the videos. As an added bonus, these custom emojis are permanent, so that means once you win one of the challenges, you will always have a custom emoji on the channel. What's the point of that? I don't know, I thought it was pretty fucking cool. It's way better than me making stupid fucking PNGs of catchphrases I stole from WWF, you know. I want it to be your critter's face in the comment section. Now, I just got to let everybody know that unfortunately, based on the way that YouTube works, you have to be a channel member to be able to use the custom emojis. And they also limit the amount of slots for custom emojis as well. So I'm going to make a random challenge every time I have a free slot, so you have an opportunity for your cat, your dog, your bird, your snake, your demigorgon, your lizard, your guinea pig, your rabbit, whatever,
to be immortalized on the channel.
So the first channel member to comment what the next video will be about, and is correct of course, will win the custom emoji challenge. Then all you gotta do is post a picture of your critter that you want turned into an emoji on the community tab. Speaking of which, if you want your critters featured in one of these videos, just post a picture of them on the community tab and type the word critter so I know that I have your permission to use it. And also please just include your pet's name. You guys have been doing a pretty great job of that so far. I don't think anyone hasn't added their pet's name to a post so far. Anyways, I just want to give a massive thank you to all of our incredible channel members and all of our super thanks donations for the extra support. It really, really means a lot to us. So with all that said, make sure to leave your thoughts and theories in the comment section below, like the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys soon with another mystery. Thanks for watching.